All right, so let's pick up where we left off on Tuesday. And let's talk about the second half of the lecture on correctional treatment. So, um, we should look at the individual and group treatments that are available to people in correctional facilities. Some of the more common ones are firstly anger management. Anger and just a general lack of self control have been linked to violent criminal activity. Anger management programs may be most frequently offered in group therapy form in prison because they can't do everything one on one. There's also cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a treatment approach that focuses on patterns of thinking and the beliefs. And this is meant to help people become conscious of their own thoughts and behaviors so they can make positive changes. The evaluations of these programs find them to be actually highly successful. So some introspection is definitely valuable. Next, there are faith-based programs, which take inmates who are involved in religion while in prison. They generally appear to do better post-release, but that difference quickly erodes if they don't change their lifestyle. Now, many treatment programs, faith-based included here, appear to be more effective with some type of inmates and less so with others. There are drug treatment types. Most prisons sponsor drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. Many of these are the same programs available in society. So think of something like Alcoholics Anonymous. Some institutions are developed around the idea of a therapeutic community. I guess I should define a therapeutic community. It's institutions that rely on positive peer pressure within a highly structured social environment in order to create positive inmate change. And lastly, HIV/AIDS treatment. These are two behaviors common in prison, which cause the spread of HIV and AIDS, sharing needles and male and same-sex relations. This creates an environment where contracting it can be much higher than it would be in the general society. Most states only test inmates if there are significant indicators of infection. All right, so let's look at the educational programs available to inmates. The first prison-based educational program was in the Walnut Street Jail in 1784, which, if you may recall, was one of the nation's first prisons, which we discussed in a previous lecture. Now, the educational programs vary substantially between prisons. Most, at the bare minimum, will enable an inmate to earn a GED if they do have an educational program. Some offer college courses. The benefits of education are clearly identified. Participation in educational programs seems to, for lack of a better term, settle inmates, kind of calms them down. Attending classes is a privilege, and it can be lost for bad behavior. People who obtain educational attainments, right? They actually go through these programs to have a lower recidivism rate, typically. All right, so every state offers some form of job-related services for inmates. We're going to look at the most common form of it, which is vocational programs. So firstly, vocational training. These programs are usually managed within prison, within their industries. They do teach marketable skills, for the most part. However, some inmates still have difficulties finding employment after they get released, which you have to think about it. It's probably because of the fact that even though they're released with some job skills, they have a criminal history. Now, regardless of how well they've developed their skills, or never, well, not never. Let's not speak in absolutes. It is difficult for them to overcome their criminal history. Some vocational programs have been criticized also for the fact that they are basically a little more than prison maintenance programs. So all they're really doing is just maintaining the prison facilities. There are other programs like work release, a prison treatment program that allows inmates to be released during the day to work in the community, then return to the prison at night. There are furloughs, which is a correctional policy that allows inmates to leave the institution for vocational or educational training for employment or to maintain family ties. While sometimes effective, work release programs sometimes produce security problems. Obviously, you have to assure that they're going to come back, right? There's also the private prison enterprise. In a few states, private companies are allowed to enter prisons and operate for-profit businesses. Many produce goods that are used within the prison system. Others produce goods that are consumed for the general public. Profits go to the state government and to the inmate laborers, but they're not getting paid very well. Lastly, post-release programs. Essentially, these are employment agencies operated by state prisons to help inmates find employment prior to release and help them maintain work during the post-release period. Services include job placement, skill development, family counseling, and legal and medical assistance. All right, so now the question that people ask themselves after hearing about these training opportunities and these programs, which cost money, right? Um, Something to ponder. Does rehabilitation work? There was a study in 1975. Robert Martinson published the results of his comprehensive review of prison rehabilitation programs. His review found that the majority of treatment programs are, lack of a better term, failures. He essentially gave rise to the nothing works mantra that you hear. Later researchers, using more sophisticated evaluation tools, found that some rehabilitation programs do work, in fact, and work rather well. The difference between programs that work and those that do not are related, I'm sorry, to three basic ideas here. The type of treatment being employed, the way in which it's being implemented, and the nature of the offenders who have applied. So what type of treatment, how it's being administered, and also by who, and the type of people receiving the treatment. Those seems to be the biggest factors. All right, so let's finally talk about COs or correctional officers. Sorry, no acronyms until we actually introduce the term. Correctional officers or COs have a interesting task at work because their work environment is pretty complex, dangerous, and engaging, which could be a good or a bad thing. Now, work conditions are typically identified as challenging for three reasons: underfunding, so not enough money to go around to maintain the facilities, hire more staff, which actually wasn't the next thing, which is understaffing. So underfunding, understaffing, and lastly, overcrowding, which seems to be a recipe for a dangerous work environment. Correctional officers often walk the fine line between two competing roles. On one hand, they are enforcers of the rules that ensure the security of the prison, and then on the other hand, they are often as like an advocate for an inmate and make rehabilitation programs available to inmates. Of course, there are high levels of stress associated with the job. I mean, you're surrounded by people who have done very bad things for the most part to get them to be there, especially violent ones. Um, so it's very stressful. However, many correctional officers report that they feel as if they can make a difference in the lives of the offenders. All right, so let's talk about female COs. Women are just as effective as men in the field of correctional officers. Sexual assaults are very rare, and the negative attitudes that are typically thrown at women COs tend to come from their peers rather than the inmates. The presence of a woman correctional officer may actually have unintended benefits and that they seem to improve the self-image of inmates. You know, the idea that you're not only looking at men, you're interacting with females too. Female correctional officers may find an assignment at a male institution may actually boost their career. Recent restrictions on male staff at female institutions have forced administrators to assign women to dormitory areas, which is probably for the best, which are, unfortunately, for everyone else, though, the least desirable areas to work. All right, so I'd like you to take a few moments, pull up your phone, go to the Note app, or have a pen and paper handy. If you can, really consider, what causes prison violence? Pause the video, take a few seconds, probably like a minute. Okay, maybe a minute, right? And write down three relevant facts about either the inmates or the environment. I guess it should be an and or statement because you can list either one because both of them are going to show up on this list. So I guess facts about inmates or the environment that would cause violence. All right, so case there's any mystery here, there is no one single explanation for why prison violence occurs. However, enough explanations have been proposed and then observed that we have classified them into individual and collective theories. So, firstly, individual violence. The history of prior violence. That makes a lot of sense, right? Violent inmates do not become non-violent just because they're in prison. I think we stated earlier, the behavior tends to continue while you're in prison. If you're violent outside, you're violent inside. Age. Younger inmates, typically, typically, especially those with a record of prior incarceration and those who have suffered persistent drug use are the ones most likely to engage in prison disruptive behavior. Psychological factors. Many inmates suffer from personality disorders. As we mentioned before, they can't all go to correctional facility, medical institutions to be looked at for personality disorders, so they end up in prison. Also, prison conditions. The prison experience itself may cause violence. Inhuman conditions, overcrowding, depersonalization, which means you lose your sense of self, and threats of sexual assault, or they all produce violence. Remember, we talked about the gang culture in prison? That's a real thing. Lack of dispute resolution mechanisms. What does that mean? Inmates are not particularly good at resolving conflict. Prisons that do not provide formal or even informal mechanisms that allow inmates an opportunity to resolve disputes experience higher levels of violence. It's like if you have a problem and you're a kid, you can go, preferably or hopefully to an adult, and they can be the person who can help you solve, decent conflict resolution, but it's not the case in prison. And lastly, basic survival. Some violence is caused by inmates who are basically staking out their territory or attempting to convince other inmates to leave them alone. Now, there are a few theories that may explain collective violence. So not only focusing on the individual here. So firstly, we have inmate balance theory, which states that riots and other forms of collective violence, we're talking about violence being committed by everyone there, or at the very least, a large enough number for it to be considered collective, occur, right? These acts of violence occur when prison officials make an abrupt effort to take control of the prison and limit freedoms. So it's a natural reaction, the inmate balance theory. And lastly, the administrative control theory. Collective violence is caused by prison mismanagement, lack of strong security, and inadequate control by prison officials. All right, so let's discuss prisoners' rights and some of the key privileges that have been granted to inmates. So prior to the 1960s, inmates were considered, how do I put this? The text labels it as civilly dead. It's a pretty strong term. What it essentially means is that they essentially had no civil liberties by virtue of their imprisonment. This was sustained by the hands-off doctrine, if you will, which essentially said that it was a legal practice allowing prison administrations a free hand to basically run the institution, even if correctional practices violate inmates' constitutional rights, which essentially ended with the onset of the prisoners' rights movement. Now, during the 1960s, advocacy groups like the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, as you may have heard them in the media, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began to file lawsuits on behalf of inmates. These lawsuits were designed to redefine, not refine, because I would be keeping the same things, making it more precise. So redefine the civil liberties of incarcerated persons. Now, in 1996, the U.S. Congress passed the Prison Litigation Reform Act. This was designed to reduce litigation. It required inmates to exhaust all in-house grievance remedies before filing a suit. Now, provisions of the act were upheld by the Supreme Court. In the case of Booth v. Turner, which essentially dealt with a request for monetary relief, and Porter v. Nussel, which dealt with the allegation of excessive force. Basically, the court ruled that it is constitutional to require that an inmate go through all administrative processes before a case can be brought to courts. But it also, inadvertently acknowledged the fact that, yes, you can come and bring your grievances to court. You just have to go through the formal proceedings before. All right, so let's go through some substantive rights. Today's incarcerated people, right? They enjoy numerous civil liberties. Inmates are entitled to have legal materials available and must be provided assistance when drawing up and filing complaints. Only when a compelling state interest exists, so something like security of the facility, can the state limit the freedom of press and expression, which is pretty good. That's a pretty solid extension of the First Amendment rights. Inmates have the right to follow the precepts of their religion unless it would create undue burden on the facility. Inmates must have access to medical services and facilities. Cruel and unusual punishment, it's not supposed to happen, right? Because it's a protection provided by the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits physical punishment or punishment that is far in excess of that given to the people under similar circumstances. Racial segregation. In general, segregation can only occur if there is a compelling interest to promote prison safety. And lastly, just overall prison conditions. This includes food, clothing, shelter, and other comforts. All right, so let's briefly go over the parole process and the problems of prisoner reentry. As we discussed earlier, we know that probation is an essential mechanism, but as we also acknowledge, parole is also super important. And it's essentially a means to allow inmates to leave confinement earlier than they were supposed to, or essentially it allows them to leave confinement prior to serving out their entire term. In some states, parole is decided by a parole board. There's typically what we call the two states model or the two state model. I'm sorry. There's discretionary and mandatory. So in the discretionary model, inmates are evaluated individually by a parole board to examine, right, or determine whether the person, the inmate who is supposed to leave, is considered an acceptable risk, right? If they're willing to accept that risk and release them to society. And there's mandatory, where inmates are given parole when the unserved portion of the maximum prison term equals to the prisoner's earned good time. All right, so I know you might be thinking right now, is parole a legal right? Is it guaranteed? The answer is no, it's not. The only thing that's a legal right guaranteed is if you are eligible for parole, you have due process clause requirements that require the proceedings to be held fairly. That's about it. That's the only legal requirement you have. How effective is parole? Well, despite efforts, many offenders, they just return to prison shortly after their release. I think if you want to take a look at the chart there on the right, it's a visual representation of recidivism. So, people getting rearrested or going back to prison, right? Of prisoners from 30 states by the time of release to the first arrest, leading to their recidivating event, which basically means when they go back to prison. You see that number for percentage is very, very high, and it correlates pretty well with time out of prison after you get released. But you see how that line starts to flatten. So there's a lot of people who get rearrested really fast. And then it starts to flatten out, which means that if you're out for a sufficient amount of time, you probably won't go back. Now, despite efforts, many people return to prison. States with the most success made extensive use of probation for petty offenders and programs that target motivated offenders to stay crime and drug free through sanctions for prison violation rewards. Basic carrot and stick approach. You do a good thing, get rewarded; bad thing, you get punished. In deciding whether parole is effective, it is important to remember that there are multiple outcome measures that can be used: rearrests, technical violations, reincarcerations, additional convictions, and so on. All right, so continuing our conversation on parole, let's go over supervision and reentry. Normally, when people are released, whether it be on probation, although right now we're talking about parole, so whether they were sentenced to probation or they got parole, they're being overseen by a parole officer. Some parole officers maintain a social work treatment orientation, which is again that they try to get at the root of the problem of the person and try to treat them so that way they don't recidivate, which leaves them to have a little bit more leeway, while others are more authoritative and rule oriented. Basically, you break the rules, you go back. In general, parole officers tend to skew more towards the authoritative spectrum, if we're going to just make that a dichotomy. Now, what are some problems with reentry? The prison experience itself may contribute to reentry problems. Being away from families are naturally going to take a toll on people. There's psychological and economic problems, which lead offenders to recidivate as well. So they've been deprived of the family for a long time. They get unsocialized, and then they don't have any economic prospects when they get out. They have a lot of issues, and ex-convicts typically just have difficulty finding jobs and maintaining jobs. All right, so why do people fail? Personal problems. Right, this is the first and foremost. This is due to someone's own lifelong personal deficits, which I know sounds a little mean, but it's the truth. Those who return to reoffending often suffer like these labels, these stigmas that reinforce their beliefs that they are outside the mainstream, that they're not normal, basically, and it adds to their personal problems. There's economic problems. Most people leave prison with no money in their savings account or checking account, no immediate entitlement to unemployment benefits because they're not getting any unemployment benefits when they get released, and few employment prospects. Prison locks people on the lowest rung of the economic ladder and leaves them there. Having a good employment record before going to prison and finding work after makes parolees less likely to recidivate. So they need to kind of already be good at working outside beforehand. Getting good afterwards really difficult. There's also family problems. Inmates with a strong social support and close family ties have a better chance of making it on the outside. Kids are hurt educationally, socially, and financially if a parent is a former inmate. There's community problems. Typically, community characteristics can influence the way parole violations are handled. More likely to have parole revoked if you're in a high unemployment area or if areas with concentrated disadvantage or social disorder. And lastly, legal problems. Many employers are reluctant to hire people who have served time. Legal restrictions make it difficult because there are prohibitions on certain kinds of employment, limits on obtaining licenses, and restrictions on freedom of movement. So there are a lot of hurdles that people have to jump through. How can we improve this? How can we improve the reentry process? Well, first, improve employment services. If people don't have the means to economically support themselves and support their families, they're going to probably turn back to what got them in prison in the first place. You have to improve the pre-parole treatment programs. You got to get them ready to go beforehand. You can't just throw them into the world. Post-release counseling, right? Some people need someone to talk to, even if it's just to stress how difficult the process is. There also needs to be specialized treatment strategies because you can't have a cookie cutter approach to everything. And lastly, reentry courts. You have to have basically an intermediary before you can throw them back in. I know some people don't want that, but it would probably help people's chances of staying out. All right, and if you're watching this now, scan the QR code and take attendance. All right, so this is what we covered this week. We went over chapter 12. I'm going to be posting quiz 7 either late Thursday evening or early Friday morning, and the quiz will be due on Sunday evening. It'll be on chapters 11 to 12. Any questions, please email me. And if not, I hope you enjoy your week.